Hi, I'm Lauren Hollows and welcome to RTO Doctors' first official video podcast. Today we are going to be discussing the topic of how to cover assessment mapping very briefly. So if you're looking for more information at the end of this podcast, please feel free to email into us at lauren@rtodoctor.com.au or give us a phone call. You can find all of our contact details on our website. So what we're covering today is we're covering assessment mapping, and what we're looking at specifically is how the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence apply within assessment mapping. So obviously the first thing we're going to go over is we're going to go over what actually needs to be put into an assessment mapping tool. And this is one of the biggest areas that we find that RTOs do seem to struggle in knowing what exactly needs to go into the assessment mapping. So when we take our first standard unit, and we're going to be covering this in a little bit more detail in the future podcast when we talk about the new streamlined training packages. So what we're going to be doing today is we're just going to be covering the standard assessment mapping tools that are used in the majority of packages at the moment. So as everybody knows, you've got to include in there just your basic title. You want to make sure that you include whether or not there are any prerequisites or if there are any additional legal or statutory requirements, particularly with things like some of the high-risk units in the RII training packages and things like that. What you then want to make sure that you go on to do is you make sure to go on and explain what the assessments are that you're going to be providing. If there's going to be any key to the mapping, you want to make sure that you have some information like that in there. And some of the assessment tools, we always recommend that you also put in there if there are specific requirements for the assessment. So for example, if assessment A needs to be undertaken before assessment B, you put some of that sort of information in there. So it's very clear to the assessors and to the auditors who are looking at it whether or not there's a specific progression that needs to be included. So moving on, the requirements that you need to have within the units. Obviously, you've got to have your elements and performance criteria. Most people we find we don't have any problems with that. And everybody generally knows that you need to have your performance, not your performance evidence that's in the new units. The required knowledge and required skills needs to be put into there as well. Critical aspects of assessments needs to be included, and again, all of these things are things that we don't tend to find any problems with the majority of RTOs. Most trainers and assessors know that it needs to be included. Some of the things that we do find that often get left out is there might be some mandatory requirements in the context of assessment or in the required resources depending on the training package. Some training packages dictate that, for example, it has to be assessed in the workplace, and this is something that you want to be looking at and becoming more familiar with, because when we move on to the new streamlined training packages, those sorts of requirements are going to become much more important, and they're going to become very specific about exactly what they're expecting to see. Within the context of assessment or the methods of assessment, they might specifically say that they want to see a practical assessment, or that they want to see a combination of practical and knowledge-based assessments in there. And then the last part, which is generally the area that we find that people really struggle as to know what to map and what not to map, is within the mandatory components of the range statement. So in regards to the range statement, what you're going to be looking at is quite often it might provide you with an example of something that was in italics up in the performance criteria, and it might say may include. So if it says may include, then feel free to, you don't need to actually have it mapped in there. That's just providing you with some additional guidance. However, where it says must include or should include or includes, any kind of language that doesn't allow you a yes or no, that there's a possibility, then that does need to be mapped into your assessment mapping tool, and you need to make sure that you include it in there. And quite often that is an area that is missed out by a lot of RTOs, and more auditors are looking very specifically to make sure that that's included. So now that you've got everything that you need in your assessment tool, what you need to be making sure is that you're covering the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. And that way you'll know that the assessment tools that you've created actually cover all the requirements of the unit and meet those two different things. So what we'll do first is we'll deal with the principles of assessment. And as many of you trainers and assessors out there would know, there are 4 principles of assessment. The first one is validity. You've also got reliability, flexibility, and fairness. So what we're going to deal with first is we're going to deal with validity and reliability, because the two of them are actually quite interrelated. So if an assessment is both valid and reliable, then what you're generally looking for is it's going to be consistent. It's going to be consistent across, it's supposed to be assisting across RTOs, it's going to be consistent within the RTO. Reliable and valid assessments have a number of characteristics and things like that that we would be looking for. So Obviously, you're going to be addressing all of the dimensions of competency. You're going to be using processes which cover, all of the different components of the unit. So what we just dealt with before, talking about covering all the components of the unit. If it's valid and reliable, then it needs to make sure that it covers all of those things. It's going to be based on evidence gathered over a number of occasions and a number of contexts. And obviously this is one of the things that we do see in RTOs all the time, where, for example, you might just have a knowledge-based test, or you might just have a practical assessment. So in order to cover that requirement of valid and reliable, it does need to have a combination. It should have over a number of occasions, so it shouldn't just all be done at one sitting. It should be done over a period of time, and it should be done in a different number of ways. So it should cover something that's a practical based task, and it should also have something that's knowledge based in there as well, in order to be able to cover all of the different aspects. Okay. That can be included into a single assessment. For example, if you've got a practical assessment with a competency conversation, that's part of one assessment. But then again, if you were doing that just solely on one occasion, that's not going to meet the requirement that it's done over a period of time. So those are very, very key things that auditors will look for, and also that in order to meet really a good framework, in order for a student to be able to provide you with evidence that is valid, that is really reliable, they need to be able to do it on more than a one-off occasion, which makes sense. What you want to be making sure is that in an ideal scenario, you're gathering on and off the job components. That's not always possible, depending on the type of training that's available, or whether or not the student is employed, but in an ideal scenario that is preferred. And also that you're providing a provision for the student to be able to provide evidence of competency if it's already there. Moving on, what we're going to be looking at, we would be looking at an assessment that is flexible and fair. Flexible and fair are fairly interrelated as well. In general, what it means is that you're providing for reasonable adjustment, which is of course a legal requirement. You also want to be making sure that you're providing very clear instructions to the students. And again, this is an area where some RTOs can struggle. The student needs to have a very clear understanding of when they're being assessed, how they're being assessed, what their options are if they don't pass the assessment, and how the assessment is being marked. Okay, and generally in competency-based training, we do very much steer people away from this idea of a grading system. It is something that a lot of students are familiar with. But in general, if you're creating an assessment that is mapped to a certain number of points, the student being 90% competent or student being 80% competent is quite anti to the idea of competency-based training. The idea at the end of the day is either they have the skills and knowledge, or they don't have the skills and knowledge yet, and you need to keep working with them until they do. Fairness will also go to whether or not you're providing the exact same assessment in the exact same way for students. Obviously, some students, depending on what the target group is that you're dealing with, the assessment needs to be contextualized, and that's where fairness and flexibility come into it as well, in that you're expected to be able to provide again, that reasonable adjustment and that contextualization to your target group. So if you're purchasing off-the-shelf resources, you need to be working with those resources before you're delivering them to your students. You should never buy an off-the-shelf resource and directly provide it to your students without taking it through moderation, validation, and generally some quite significant contextualization to the target groups that you're dealing with. Okay. Moving on, what we will be looking at is we would be looking at the rules of evidence. And what I would definitely recommend to a lot of you is that you actually go and look through your training packages. Some training packages do require additional requirements in regards to what they're looking for evidence of competency. And it's something that you should be looking into because with specific training packages, there are additional requirements. For example, as I've said before, they might very specifically say that you must be doing some assessment in the workplace. And as we've said, moving on for the new streamlined training packages, this requirement is going to become very clear, and it's also going to come down to even saying that assessments need to be delivered a specific number of times in the workplaces, or that tasks need to be delivered in a specific number of times, And if you're looking for more information on this, as I said, we will be going into it in a future podcast into a little bit more detail. Okay, so moving on to the rule of evidence, or the rules of evidence is the other area that you would need to be making sure that you're covering when you're looking at your assessment mapping guides. And just quickly, what I'll touch on is I'll touch on the actual different types of evidence. So you've got 3 different types of evidence. You've got direct, indirect, and third party. Direct and indirect are the 2 types of knowledge that you would be mapping. You might put into your mapping guides that you've got third party available, but in the case of most auditors, what most auditors will say is that's what's called supplementary evidence. So if that's what you're relying on as a primary form of evidence, then it's generally something that the majority of auditors will not accept. And what you want to be making sure is that you've got forms of direct and indirect evidence as your primary forms of evidence. So make sure that you've got at least one type of direct and one type of indirect in an ideal scenario. So your direct evidence is things, for example, where you're actually seeing them perform a specific skill, where you're observing them, or where you're doing oral questioning, because there's no question in any of those scenarios that you're getting the information directly from the student. It's generally done in a face-to-face scenario, although of course it can actually be done through the internet if it's done through oral questioning, if you're looking at the person as they're providing you with their examples. Indirect evidence would be, for example, if you're getting the student to create a project, or if you're getting them to do a written assessment, if they're providing evidence of work that they've previously undertaken, statements of attainment, things like that. Written tests of underpinning knowledge, so knowledge-based tests, all of those would be considered indirect evidence. The third party has become definitely an issue over the last couple of years, and if you are using third-party reports and you feel that you do need to include that because of the way that you're training, then that's fine. But what you want to be making sure is that in no way are you just taking the performance criteria, cutting them and pasting them into something like an observation log and then calling that a third-party report. If you are utilizing third-party reports from the workplace supervisors, in an ideal scenario, those supervisors would have their certificate for and training assessment. If not, and you're just using it as a supplementary form of evidence, you still need to be making sure that you're transferring that information into the kind of language that an employer can understand. So don't take the performance criteria and cut and paste it over. Look at that performance criteria, see what kind of a task it would be applicable to, perhaps provide an example, and put it into that very much industry language so that the employer can understand exactly what it is that they're going to be looking for in the students. Okay, so moving on to the rules of evidence, obviously again we've got 4 rules of evidence. We've got valid, sufficient, current, and authentic. And valid, again, is very much tied into your principles of assessment. We've covered that in some detail. The only additional thing that I'll add in there is that in addition to, making sure that you're addressing all of the, unit criteria and the 4 dimensions of competency, just double check that you're also providing evidence of how you're mapping to the employability skills, and that the way that you're delivering the unit and the assessments you're providing for the unit are appropriate to the AQF level being assessed. So moving on to sufficient, what we want to be making sure when you're doing sufficient, again, what that basically goes back to is that you're making a judgment, and it's generally done over a period of time. Okay, it's done for the entire context of the unit, so it's addressing all of those competencies that we've discussed previously, and that you're providing evidence against every single point. So again, this is another area that we do come up with some training organisations, is that, for example, you might have 2 separate assessments. You might have a practical assessment, and you might have a knowledge-based test, so you've got 2 assessments. But they don't actually cover every criteria twice. So for example, you might have one performance criteria that's only covered by one assessment, and then another performance criteria is covered by the other assessment. What you need to be making sure is that you're covering each of those criteria on a minimum of 2 occasions. So for example, if your performance criteria says that the worker performs works safely in the job role, or they can conduct manual lifting in a safe way, they need to be able to do that on more than one occasion. You need to be able to see them performing that over a range of time, or you might be asking them a question on it, and then you're watching them perform the skill. So every criteria within the unit is covered on more than one occasion. It needs to be current, so obviously this generally isn't a problem when you're doing general training and assessment, although what you would want to make sure is that you're not conducting the training, and if, for example, you were conducting it through a cluster, you wouldn't want to start the training in 2011 and complete the training in 2012, if it was a full year apart, for example. What you want to be making sure is that when you're deeming a student competent, you're deeming them competent for assessments that you've recently seen them, or skills that you've recently seen them perform, for example. Often currency, the issue with currency really comes more into RPL, and again, we will be doing a future podcast on good practices for RPL. But what generally you want to be seeing is, if you're looking at RPL and you're looking at evidence that you're taking from a student, you wouldn't be, deeming a student current if they had achieved the, if they performed those skills more than 2 years ago, really. A lot of auditors are even now saying that it needs to have been within the past 12 months. Some people will push that out to 2 years, and ultimately it is up to the RTO to make that decision. But generally what we would recommend is that you're keeping that within a period of about 12 to 18 months if you're looking at making sure that they're going to meet those currency requirements. And then again, the last one is authentic, and this is a fairly straightforward one, and basically what you're going to be making sure is you're going to be making sure that it's the student's own work. So if you're working in an RTO or you're providing assessments where there's a lot of group-based training, what you want to be making sure is that you've got the evidence that you're providing is not just group-based evidence, that the evidence that you're gathering for that student of their competency is specific to that student, that you've got a majority of individual assessments covered within that task. Okay, so putting it all together, again, what we want to be making sure is you want to be making sure that you've got everything put into there, from the unit description to the performance criteria all the way through to the mandatory requirements of the range statement. You want to be making sure that you're covering everything off on a minimum of at least 2 occasions. And you want to be making sure that you're providing clear evidence that question is mapping up to question. So I guess that's the last thing that I would make sure is that please don't have an assessment mapping guide that is just a whole lot of X's. If you're using a knowledge-based test, then it should be the questions that you're mapping to the criteria. If you are doing a practical assessment and you've got several tasks, then you're mapping each of those individual tasks to the assessment. You're not mapping the assessment overall. Now, there will be some criteria which perhaps are applicable to the overall assessment. For example, if you're doing it in required skills, you might see something along the lines of, communicates well, and if it's oral questioning that you're using for the entire assessment, then the entire assessment might be applicable, so you might put an X in that scenario. But generally, what auditors are looking for, and in order to make sure that you're actually really covering off the assessment thoroughly, you want to be mapping a specific task or a specific question to a specific performance criteria, required skill, etc., etc. That's about all for today. If you have any other questions on mapping, or if you are in need of a mapping tool, we do have a range of resources on our website which can help you. That's www.rtodoctor.com.au. If you have any further questions about assessment tool mapping, please feel free to give us a yell. You can send us a tweet on Twitter, you can post on our Facebook page or our LinkedIn page, and we'll be more than happy to try and help you out. So again, thank you very much for your time. My name is Lauren Hollis, Director of RTO Doctor. Have a great day and best of luck with your mapping.